Hello, welcome to this month's Sisters for Financial Independence Roundtable. Today we are going to discuss motherhood from our three perspectives, and I thought this was a timely conversation given there's so much talk about the cost of childcare, the difficulties of motherhood when you don't have paid parental leave in the US, when the cost of everything else is rising, is it the right time to have a child, and so forth. Now, there is really no right answer and no right decision. Each decision is personal to everyone, but I thought I would get, of course, our panel today, which is my sisters, the Sisters for Financial Independence. So thank you for joining us. If you would like to introduce yourself a little bit and kind of give you where you are in terms of maybe deciding or already have a child and whatnot, so everyone understands like your perspective.
I'm Anna. I have one child, a son that will be 4 in June. My husband and I are in the process of deciding whether we want to pursue another child or try to have another child. Um, so we'll see how the next year pans out.
Hi, everyone. My name's Elaine. I am 28. I am child free, and I think I want to stay child free. So that's kind of where my perspective is.
Thank you. So I'm Catherine Agupjan, and I have one child, a daughter. She's going to be 5 in June. And I also want to start this conversation also for maybe for you, Elaine, because I kind of wish that someone talked to us about motherhood and having children either early in life or later in life and what that entails, right? Like a lot has happened in the past years that has kind of like changed my perspective on having a child, as well as just the societal, environmental, financial factors that go into having a child. And when I feel like when I was in my 20s, you didn't have to decide whether you wanted children or not. Like you didn't have to know. Like that was kind of something that was far off. Like you still had to go maybe to grad school, you still had to work your career and so forth. And but I feel like that conversation got like pushed to the back burner a little bit until it arrived, and then it was kind of like maybe not too late, but just a little bit late in being able to maybe find a career that fit better in terms of scheduling when you have a child and so forth. So hopefully this is also insightful for those that are still deciding or early in their years when it comes to thinking about having children, but also maybe also give you a perspective from the both of us, some Anna and I, about what has it been like to have a child. So I guess the first thing that I will ask both of you is that like kind of if you read art news articles, maybe watch some YouTube videos in the news, you've probably seen the impact of children as far as finances. Have you been thinking about that? Are you getting those news articles? What are you thinking about when it comes to deciding whether to have a child in the future or now that you have a child about that's its financial impact for on your life or your on your wealth building strategy?
I see, I see the article, I see TikToks, reels of just like the costs of children. Um, it's not just raising your child, it's like preparing to have a child, right? Wanting to get pregnant, the price of being pregnant, giving birth, actually raising the child from, infancy to at least 18 or what have you. Um, and college, there's all these other costs that just add up. And I don't know, I can't fathom the price. It just seems like a lot. And especially in the US, with like um our healthcare system and whatnot, it's like I see the prices of people coming back just to give birth at the hospital and you're like, what? Why is it X amount of dollars? So it just seems absurd to me.
Yeah, the healthcare aspect is a big one. I think it ties a lot of people to work that they may not
Mhm.
be, fully in love with. Uh, so it's the insurance factor is something that is a big one. It's very expensive. We had paid for insurance when I wasn't working and my husband was also, we were both kind of 1099 employees at the same time. We had to pay out of pocket like almost 2 grand. So that's very costly.
Mhm.
And I don't know how it is for, I know there some states subsidize it, but if you're paying for other factors also, if you're paying for other expenses like daycare, that might be like another 2 grand. It's just like it does add up quickly. Um, there are ways to, mitigate those costs. Like for example, we have um, uh, my son's grandmother and grandfather looking after him for like 2 days out of the week. So like we don't have to pay for 5 days entirely. Um, but yeah, it does get expensive. But at the end of the day, I think it's a cost that my husband and I have both agreed to bear. So
I think right now I feel like cost is the big thing that gets thrown around too, as far as
hmm
like having a child now or in the future, especially the cost of childcare. You mentioned healthcare,
yeah.
insurance, and so forth. So how can one prepare for something like that? Like how if you were looking at yourself like maybe a few years back then, what would you tell yourself as far as how you could prepare for something like this? This is like a big life event. This is not something like easy. This is not something simple. And it's not also just like a one-time thing that you're putting money for. What would you say to someone who really wants to have a child or is not sure yet, right? It's one of the things that I knew going in was that like I knew I did not want to have a child. I don't know if that makes sense. Like I knew
Yeah.
I wanted a child, but I wasn't like if it happened, it happened. If it didn't, I might would have found alternative options, I think. But I know that I did not want not to have one. I guess that's a kind of like a thing. And I know that there's some people that by a certain age, they are absolutely want to be they want to live child free. And I think you have to take solace in that decision, knowing that like you've made the decision. And then yes, you could always back out of that decision, but you've also made a decision, and that's something that you should be proud of yourself for making that decision and like moving forward with it, not letting society kind of like sway you one way or the other. Of course, unless you change your mind personally. Like sometimes we don't know until like all these other events happen. But how else can someone plan ahead for wanting a child in the future?
I think one way of doing it is if you're both having, if you're living as dinks, like dual income, no kids, to really try to live off of one person's salary. It might be like a little bit of a stretch, but I think for some people, whether it's the mother or the father, it might be beneficial at the end of the day for one to stay at home rather than pay such like high costs for daycare and not, there might be like a little bit of mom guilt or maybe dad guilt where if you're dropping off your son or daughter and you're not seeing them a lot, it weighs on you to a point where it's not really, beneficial for you to be at work because you may not be, fully um, involved in what you're doing. So one aspect is to really just live off of one income and see if you can try it that way. But that also kind of forces the savings. That way, if it does happen that one person wants to stay at home, you already kind of have the mechanisms to see if it works or not.
I think that's a good point because I think there's a lot of families that are going into having a child with a double income, right? So they're used to this
Mhm.
lifestyle. They may have
Right.
bought a home based on two incomes. And
Right.
then the decision comes when you're like, okay, I'm going to have a child. I'm looking at all these costs. It's actually maybe I break even when it comes to childcare. Maybe it makes sense. Maybe you're feeling like, you know what, I wanted to become a mother. I wanted to be home. I think it does. I agree with you that I think you need to look at your finances early on to see
hmm
what's feasible. I also want to add that like I would talk to your partner early on about what this means. And of course, this is going to be one of those like kind of like scary conversations and maybe conversation that seems so forward, right? Because you want a partner that is going to support the decision that you're going to make as a family. And sometimes the decision might be different and it might require that you actually change your lifestyle,
Right.
right? Going from one income, two incomes to one, that's going to be a lifestyle change. So women, especially in the early years, maybe in the early months of dating or maybe even marriage, that they start having the conversation so they understand and plan ahead for it too. Elaine, as far as like your friends groups, you're kind of like a little bit almost in the 30 age group. How are your friends coupled up? where are they in discussing marriage, children, and kind of this sequence of events that usually happens when you get older. That's maybe sometimes a lot of it's societal expectations, but maybe a lot of it's
Mhm.
just like also pressure from friends. What are you seeing in your age group?
So I'm at a point where my friends are just starting to get engaged and married. So I'm not fully surrounded by people that are married or have kids yet. But I do know like those that are married or are engaged or want or in long-term relationships that they do want kids, and that those are open conversations that we've had or that they've had with their partners. Um, but on the opposite end, I have also have friends that are just single, doing whatever they want. So I do see both ends. Um, I would say we all see, the discussions about children. I don't think either party is ignoring it or what have you. Um, I think I had one friend who had just gotten married, so immediately there was already these expectations kind of put on her, like, when are you having a kid? What about this timeline? And it's like she's only been married for a few weeks, and it's like give her like she just wants to enjoy being married.
Right.
So I do see some of that societal expectation placed on people.
And cultural too, probably too, right? Like there's a lot of certain cultures that kind of want a big family and want that generation kind of built on from the start. Kind of decided I wanted to stay home with my child. Um, Earlier on, but the pandemic kind of cemented my place because my child was 9 months old when the pandemic started, and I actually had this idea that like after a year, I would go back to work. I would um, maybe do part-time work or do some kind of like hybrid model. Of course, I didn't realize that the pandemic would come and there was no daycares available. I also didn't feel comfortable sending her to one. I also didn't feel comfortable going into a work environment after that. So it was a decision that was kind of like made for me. But also, I had something that when we were growing up, our dad was the one that stayed home to care for Elaine. So I had that kind of like model that it was possible to
Mm.
be a stay-at-home parent at one point, and then maybe after your child goes to school and do something else from there. So I had that in my mind. Anna, was that something that was in your mind, or did you already know that like you're going to go back to work after having your son, and what was that decision process like for you?
Well, at the time when I had Rocco, I was full time with my company. My husband was a realtor at the time, and he was 1099. So we had insurance coverage through my company. So it wasn't so much a choice, but an obligation
Hmm.
to stay at the company. And I did like working also, kind of exercising my brain. And I also got lucky during COVID. Luckily, I was at home for, well, for maternity leave, but also for like the first 9 months altogether for my son's life, because people weren't going back into the office yet. But after that, we so after my son was born, I was actually working full time for about a year and a half. And during that time, I was lucky enough to have lived-in help. So our parents were living with my husband and I and our son because they were stuck here from the pandemic. So that kind of benefited me. But I think once they were ready to go back to the Philippines, I started questioning if whether me working full time was, I should continue doing that. And I think when I think they had kind of given their decision that they were going to go back eventually, I started kind of playing around with the idea of going part time, and that's when I left my full time company to cut down my hours, essentially to kind of help the to not juggle the family dynamics as much.
Hmm.
Um, and I was also getting very strained. I was commuting into the city 2 days out of the week, and it's like a 4 hour commute for each day. So that was getting very tiring. And it was also to the point where Rocco was getting a little bit older. He was nearing he was close to 2 now at this point. He was starting to talk, and then when I was coming home at 7:30 at night after leaving at 7 o'clock in the morning, he would be greeting me at the sliding glass door, and he would just be like, "Mama, mama." So
Oh.
I think that kind of pulled on my heartstrings a little bit, and I was like, I think it's time for me to be closer to home,
Hmm.
um, and not have to do this commute like back and forth. So that kind of cemented my decision of not working full time anymore, stepping away from like the city life and doing it remotely and doing it part time also.
When we're young, the commute seems feasible. It's easy, right? I mean, it's not easy, but it's a commute. It's still time out of our lives to do. But there is, I also feel like there's this kind of interesting energy exchange that happens when you go to work, take that 2 hour commute to and from, 4 hours of your time. That's energy that's kind of like a little bit draining you, so that by the time you get home, you don't necessarily have the energy or the bandwidth, the mental capacity to be with your family, maybe talk to your partner or be there for your kids. I think that's something that I think, if you are about to be a parent or thinking about it, to consider that aspect too, right? Like, I think right now there's a lot of jobs that allow for work flexibility, work from home, and I think that's crucial to actually being able to be home and raise kids. But as you think about your future career, as you think about your next job, and also the fact that if you're going to be having a child at some point, think about that. Like, how will that your commute impact your family life? And what will that do to you? So another layer to think about when you're thinking about children and having kids.
Yeah, and just overall the mental energy that that you need, when you have kids, to kind of coordinate daycare, coordinate, making sure that they have the diapers and like, the formula and like all these like little things that kind of play, that are just playing in your head. It is a little bit of a mental load that if you add on the work full time and like other personal, your relationships with your spouse and like your parents, it is a lot to kind of manage. So I'm not sure like what the best way to do it, but
Elaine, what about like if you when you're dating, or if you're comfortable sharing, like, do you have these conversations? Have you had these conversations with people you've dated in the past, or have you seen maybe kind of like glimpses of how your life would be if you were to go down a particular path with like certain people you're dating or maybe potential partners? Like, can you talk a little about that?
So in the past, I was in a long-term relationship of over 5 years, and pretty early in that relationship, we had talked about children, and I had expressed that I don't think I want kids, or like I can't promise you that my mind will change in however many years. And it did get to a point where we just couldn't do it anymore. We just knew that like it wasn't worth staying in that relationship among other things that were happening. So that's one of the main reasons why that relationship didn't work out. And I do think that's like an important conversation to have. And we started dating during college. So in college, you're not really thinking about it. And then once you're out of college and you're in like more long-term relationships, people get more serious. You start talking about it. So there was that part. But once I was out of the relationship and I was on like dating apps, for example, if you're like on your profiles, you can actually select if you want children or don't want children, which it wasn't always like that, but now that's an option.
Interesting. Okay, I know that.
And so now that I'm on it, I'm like, oh, all these guys want children. It's like at some point during my time in this relationship, everyone flipped, right? Because no one's thinking about it. But now everyone's like kind of locking in. And so with that aspect, it does limit the dating pool. And it's dispiriting, but it is what it is. Like I have to stand my ground about it.
Is there an option for a maybe?
Yeah, so you can say like unsure or something like that. But if that's something you're looking for in a profile, then that might be a major green flag, red flag, what have you.
I think this is important, especially I guess as you get closer to, I mean, this concept of like the biological clock, right? Like, is that something that you've thought about, or did you think about that, Anna? Because I didn't really think about that, and I had my child at 36, but also I was anchoring our mom, who actually had Elaine later in life, right? Like at 39?
39.
At 39. So I was like, okay, I still have this much time actually, because our mom, who had 2 kids before, then had my sister years later, and it was fine. Like, she was okay.
Yeah.
Elaine turned out fine, and it was okay. So my anchor was a little bit different too. But
I think about that all the time.
That you
I
have,
use,
you're
yeah,
anchoring on that, on
yeah.
that.
So like I always have thought like, well, our mom was 39 when she had me, and I came out okay. um, and while modern medicine has advanced and whatnot,
Mhm.
I don't know, you can't always guarantee that like these geriatric or advanced maternal age pregnancies are going to work out. But I don't know. There was a point. I don't know if I've ever said this, but a couple of years ago, you both of you didn't have kids yet, and I wasn't sure like what your family planning was like because that wasn't something we had discussed. And I was like, what if they both don't have kids? Do I need to have a kid to continue? And so like I was like, oh, that's I've never had to consider that, but that crossed my mind.
That's interesting, actually, that for you it was like, well, am I obligated to, or am I like,
Yeah.
I need to carry on the family?
I definitely had that that sense of the biological clock ticking though.
Hmm.
Even with Mamang, even with our mother, having had Elaine at 39, it was I still kind of knew scientifically that, when you get to your mid 30s, especially 35, when they call you like advanced maternal age, that's kind of, I don't know why it has to be like the breakoff point,
Yeah.
like the cliff where your fertility goes down. But I had my son, I think, right before I turned 35. So it was, yeah, I had it. Full disclosure, my husband and I had been trying for a little bit. It's just that we had kind of pursued a clinic and then we stopped. And then right before 35 is when like I aggressively was like going after, going through treatments to have a baby. Because before then I was kind of like, oh, kind of wishful thinking that hopefully it would happen. But
Hmm.
yeah, after a certain point, I was like, I need to be
I have to,
realistic.
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think I think it's good to be realistic too about that. I know that
Hmm.
there's a lot of women too that have started maybe at a certain age. They're like, you know what, I'm going to freeze my eggs because I really want kids, but I don't have a partner yet, or I'm not in a place where I can have kids. Um,
Hmm.
that never really occurred to me, probably because I'm no one in my circle did it, but I know now that there's a lot of women that are doing it, and I don't know if this is because of a generational thing or an age thing or maybe a money thing. Have you come across like a lot of friends that have done that or thinking about it?
But I have a couple of friends that are like, I think I want to freeze my eggs because they might not be in a relationship or not in a long-term
Hmm.
relationship. So they're kind of doing that timeline of, well, maybe I'll get in a relationship soon. I'll be in that relationship for X amount of years, get married. And then by that time, how old am I? So they've already are kind of thinking of that timeline and, thinking about their eggs and wondering, when is the right time to do that? And like, they know it's expensive and those are the other considerations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's expensive, right? Like I don't know what the actual cost, but I know that it does run in like several thousands to go through that process. Elaine, as you've been watching Anna and I navigate having children, motherhood, what was the most surprising thing either you learned or found out about during our journeys? Was there anything that was surprising to you, or did you kind of understood that this is this is the way it is?
I guess a couple of things. One, raising kids is not easy. It's a lot of time and energy and effort. I guess just seeing how much time it actually takes. Um, Given I was, our father was a stay-at-home father. He was a homemaker. So I spent a lot of time with him and we were on a single income household. So I kind of, benefited from the idea of just having at least one parent at home watching me and whatnot. And like to this day, I think most families have a hard time being a single income household. And so now you have both parents going to work, doing this, doing that. It's a lot of time and energy. Um,
Hmm.
and, not even just like the serious stuff, like going to work and whatnot, just like, I think kind of going into time is also just how much things have changed since my own childhood
Hmm.
because I'll think about how mine is different from yours, but then I'll think about how mine is different from um, like your daughter and son. I'm like, whoa, things are really different. Um, and like, with things like Montessori is not new, but it's kind of like widespread now, or like terms like gentle parenting, or even just like the widespread use of like phones and tablets and the idea of like an iPad baby, like things like that. Like, I don't know, it's very different. And it's hard to compare how I grew up with like the new generations and, vice versa.
I Speaking of that, I also feel like a lot of like parenting advice, it's like it's drilled down to like these bite-sized captions on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, and it's a little off-putting sometimes because it's either very simplified
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
very like brief.
Right.
And let me tell you that it's not like as simple as like saying a different word to your child. Like it takes like steps to get your child to do something. And it takes like all of these other things in the background that has to happen for you to have a good relationship with your child, have a day where you're not yelling at each other, and with your partner too. So I'm a little bit concerned about how social media is portraying some of aspects of parenthood, I think too. And I think Elaine, that's like a point that I think we have to be careful in what we also see in social media. Like some of it is good,
Mhm.
some of it's bad. Not all of it is it's
Yeah.
not all of it is fun. You don't just not all day going to Target and buying all this stuff or in cute outfits. There's a struggle, right? There's a financial struggle, an emotional struggle, a mental struggle and a physical struggle. Like we're all like, oh, you're 6 weeks, you're bouncing back from having a child, but there's all of these things happening, and sometimes people just gloss over that fact.
Yeah, I also wonder if motherhood is enjoyable in other countries, is more enjoyable, I
Mm,
should say.
okay.
Um, just because in the US, there are a lot of activities that are pushed on kids. And in turn, the parents have to, shuttle them around from like one thing to another. So it almost seems like your schedule is like that of like a full-time, employee
Hmm.
for your kids.
I feel
Um,
like that surprised me a lot, watching you raise your children. I feel like I didn't know anyone before the age of 5. Like I just stayed with like immediate family and like family friends. But I
mhm,
see like your son and daughter, like they have activities, they do this, do they that. It
yeah,
changes on the season. Like they have a
yeah.
birthday every weekend. And I'm like, do
Yeah,
you have
I
time
wonder
for
if it's
yourself?
like, is it too much? Or like, what is enough?
Yeah,
At what point do you say, no, I can't make it? It's just because you don't want to, you also don't want them to be the kid that, gets left
that
out.
doesn't.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's like a fine, it's like a juggling act, kind of like balancing, whose birthday you want to go to versus,
Mhm.
if you just want to stay home and veg,
Yeah.
if that's even possible with a child.
Well, you know what's interesting though, because I know Anna and I grew up in the Philippines, and we grew up next to our cousins. Like our mom's sisters lived in the area. So for us, our day to day was hanging out with our neighbors, hanging out with our cousins, playing around outside. Like it was a different environment to grow up. So there was no such thing as like us going to activities over scheduling. We would make our own activities as long as we came back to get ready for school and then go to school and then come back for more play, more whatever we need to do. So it's definitely something I think that I, in my mind, mentally have to think about too. That like when I was growing up, it wasn't like this, and I wish I could say that like in the neighborhood we are, it's easy for my daughter to find someone to play with, but everyone is like such an it's everyone's also doing those activities. They're also overscheduled. Like we barely see our neighbors sometimes, right? They're also going from one place to the other. So I wish it was a little bit like we're a little bit closer in that we can hang together instead of like having to go to these activities to keep them occupied and ourselves occupied kind of thing. So yeah, and I have to say that those activities also add up. So that's something that you have to
Mhm.
financially plan for. Like you can, and of course there's a lot of things that you can do for free. So I think if you are going to be moving to like this one income household and a one income lifestyle, you have to start being resourceful as a parent for all the things that are available that you can do for free and it's still fun with your children.
Yeah. There's always the playground or the library.
Yeah.
Those are always good options.
Anna, as far as like what advice would you give to someone who is deciding whether or not to have kids, or what do you recommend that they do ahead of time before baby comes?
Financially
Oh,
or like
all
altogether?
all of it all together.
Oh God. I don't know if there's really like a I don't think you can ever be prepared for having a
Mhm.
kid. I know everybody's always like, "Get your sleep now,"
Yeah.
and it's true because you will get sleep deprived unless you have like a night nurse. But I think it's just being adaptive, just going with the flow of things. I think that's probably what I needed more of,
Mhm.
to kind of just be more flexible with how things were and to understand, give yourself a little bit of grace, um, before and, postpartum, because you are adjusting to, this new life. Your hormones are up and down, up and down. Um, and I don't know, and also just keep your keep the communication with your partner open. I think that's going to be key also, because there's certain things that your partner isn't going to fully understand.
Mhm.
Um, so just make sure that you're talking to them on a daily basis, and telling them if they're getting on your nerves and what they can do to help. So I think that's, I guess, one advice.
A lot can happen when the child comes, and as a new mother, your mental capacity, I think, changes.
Hmm.
So that I think the conversation with your partner is going to be critical, right? There's going to be some things that you need to offload to your partner, and you're gonna either need to very explain succinctly what needs to happen so that you are not disappointed by the result. I think expectations is a big thing. Um,
Isn't there a book out there that's like
yes.
how not to get divorced when you have a
Oh,
baby or something
oh,
like that?
I don't know that book,
Okay.
but maybe we'll share it up around here. I'll
Okay.
share that book, and I also recommend the book called P- Playfair
I've
or,
seen that book.
by Eve
Okay.
Rodsky. She has playing cards for it too. It's to help you divvy up the mental load that happens at
The
home.
mental load.
Yeah, something like that. The mental load that happens at home, so you can it's not going to be equal, but at least not all of it will come to you. And I would also just recommend that, like, as you're saving for this new life for yourself, put in a budget that allows you to take care of yourself. Maybe get someone to clean your house so that you are not thinking about it and worrying about it. Like, these are costs that they will cost your family, but they're not going to be like huge budget breakers as long as you plan for it, right? And they will be most likely a lifesaver for your family. Like, coming home to a clean house is so nice, because you didn't have to do the sweat. You probably were able to get out of the house, and to do some errands. And it's just some of those things that you want to budget for nice things when you are busy with all these other things too. And the last thing I would also do is that, like, I know, like, there's a lot of men out there or even women that aren't really exposed to children. So maybe they don't have
Mhm.
nieces or nephews and don't know how to change a diaper, don't know how to do a lot of things, and it takes time. You have to learn, but it's possible for people to learn. But you have to, your partner has to be willing
Hmm.
to learn at that point, because at this point there's no choice, right? You don't
Right.
want to be doing everything to yourself, so you want a partner that's willing to change and be in the game of parenthood.
Right. Nobody wants to be the best at changing a diaper. You just need to do it.
You just do it. You just do it. And it stops at some point, right?
Right.
Like, at some point
Hmm.
it stops and you're like, you're not worrying about it anymore.
Right.
You
So
have
if
other
you're
worries, but
one other thing I would also advise, with the financial aspect, if you are working full time, if you have the benefits, for paid family leave or short term disability, get those ducks in order before, like a month before your plan to go out, because you don't want to be dealing with that during your maternity or paternity leave. It adds to the mental load. It might stress you out. It stressed me out when I didn't have it in place, and it's just something that you probably shouldn't have to, take care of. I mean, I wish we had universal paid family leave in the United States, but unfortunately we don't. Luckily, some states do have it. So, take advantage of it. You are paying into it, in your taxes. So definitely look into that.
Yeah. And I would also add just one thing, if you're in a corporate environment where they do offer you health insurance, if you know you are going to be expecting in the new year, take a look at your health plans and if it's necessary, upgrade to one. Like it's going to cost you a little bit more, but upgrade to the better one. And I say that because I didn't have an issue during my pregnancy, thankfully, even though but I had to do all these testing because I was AMA. I was over 35. Um, and still there was cost to giving birth, going to the hospital, delivery and labor and all of that. But after, unfortunately, my daughter had to stay in the ER afterwards, because she had jaundice and wasn't getting enough nutrition. So we had to stay in the emergency room. That's money, that's cost, as well as a stay in the pediatric um, unit. So even if you feel like you're healthy, even if you're like um, within age, a lot of things can happen. So upgrading for peace of mind, even for just this year that you're about to have a child, I think it's worth the money and it's probably worth not having to worry about those kinds of costs coming in. Anything else to add before we wrap up?
I wanted to plug in some accounts that I follow or browse in my spare time
Mhm.
regarding alternative families and like, family planning and whatnot. Um, because even though I don't really want children of my own, I do think about what are the other ways of, raising a child. So I do look at, what is adoption like? What is fostering like? So I'll say it here, but I'll give it to Kathy to put in the description below. But I follow foster.parenting, foster the teens, there's an account called We Are Childfree _ that I also follow. And then there's another account that kind of relates back to the mental load, which is Real Zach Think Share. And that's kind of interesting because it's a guy talking about, well, this is probably what your wife's dealing with. You should probably change that. Um, so those are kind of like different kinds of accounts that I still expose myself to. I think people think just because I don't want kids, I hate children, which is not the case. um, and there's other means of having a family, raising a family, and building a community.
Mhm. And I
I
think it's
think
still
that's
super important for you though, as an aunt. Like you're still around kids. We want you to be around our kids. So, for you to like have that hand in still raising children is still super important in the community and still in our family as well.
yeah. It takes a village, so
It's true. Very true.
any little help.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you so much for joining us today in our roundtable, Motherhood from Three Perspectives. We hope maybe we'll have another discussion about this, maybe down the line, if anything changes. Check out this video if you want to prepare financially, and this other video if you want more help with your money so you can get financially straight before baby comes, and to grow your family a little bit wealthier. We will see you next time.